Good day, class. I'm Dr. Idelfa Elevazo, and I'm about to discuss with you the auditory and the vestibular pathways. This lecture is divided into two parts. The first part is about the auditory pathway, while the second part is about the vestibular pathway. So let's start with the auditory pathway. At the end of the lecture, you should be able to understand the neural pathways for hearing by tracing the course of the nerve impulses from the organ of Corti to the primary auditory cortex and by correlating clinically why a lesion of the auditory pathway on one side results in decrease of hearing acuity in one or both ears. Let's review the pathway of sound. Sound waves enter the external ear and cause vibration of the tympanic membrane. These vibrations of the tympanic membrane are transmitted to the inner ear through the oval window via the three ossicles, namely the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. These pressure waves generated in the perilymph travel across the vestibular membrane to the endolymph of the scala media or cochlear duct, and also up the scala vestibuli and down the scala tympani via the helicotrema. This caused the basilar membrane to ripple, leading to subsequent bending or displacement of the hair cells of the organ of Corti as they come in contact with the tectorial membrane. At this point, the mechanical sound stimulus is converted into a nervous impulse. In a little while, we will be discussing the propagation of this nerve impulse to the primary auditory cortex via the cochlear part of the vestibulocochlear nerve. In the auditory pathway, the physical stimulus is the sound. The pitch or intensity of the sound corresponds to the frequency, and this is measured in hertz. The loudness of the sound corresponds to the amplitude, and this is measured in decibels. Human ear can detect sound frequencies from 20 to 20,000 hertz and loudness from 1 to 120 decibels. The range of the human voice is from 300 to 3000 hertz. People who are constantly exposed to sound level exceeding 85 decibels are required to wear hearing protectors such as earplugs to reduce the noise exposure level and thus decrease the risk of hearing loss. Note that the ear damage depends on the length of the exposure as well as the degree of the decibel level. In the organ of Corti, the sound stimulus is converted into a nervous impulse by the process called transduction. It contains two types of receptors, the inner hair cells and the outer hair cells. The inner hair cells are the true auditory receptor cells. There are 10 spiral ganglion cells innervating one inner hair cell, and each spiral ganglion cell innervates only one inner hair cell. Thus, each inner hair cell sends information to the brain along 10 separate channels to ensure that the auditory information reaches the cerebral cortex. The outer hair cells, on the other hand, are contractile in function, and they control the sensory response properties of the organ of Corti by regulating the opposition of the tectorial membrane to the inner hair cells. There is tonotopic organization in the organ of Corti, meaning the highest tone stimulates the inner hair cells located in the basal portion of the cochlea, and the lowest tone stimulates the inner hair cells located in the apical portion of the cochlea. Moving on, let's trace the auditory pathway. The inner hair cells of the organ of Corti are the true auditory receptor cells. Neuron 1 corresponds to the spiral or the cochlear ganglion, found in the modulus of the bony cochlea. The spiral ganglion contains bipolar neurons. The peripheral processes of the spiral ganglion cells terminate on the inner hair cells, while the central processes form the cochlear nerve. The cochlear nerve, together with the vestibular nerve, pass through the internal auditory meatus to enter the brainstem at the pontomedullary junction. At this point, the cochlear nerve fibers terminate on the cochlear nuclei, namely dorsal and ventral cochlear nuclei. These cochlear nuclei are located lateral to the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and they correspond to neuron 2 of the auditory pathway. From the cochlear nuclei will arise three projections called acoustic striae. They are the dorsal, intermediate, and ventral acoustic striae. The dorsal acoustic stria arises from the dorsal cochlear nucleus and sends fibers that cross to the contralateral lateral lemniscus. The intermediate acoustic stria has the same course as the dorsal acoustic stria, except that the fibers originate from the ventral cochlear nucleus. Take note that some of the fibers of the dorsal and intermediate acoustic striae synapse on the nuclei of the lateral lemniscus before they project to the inferior colliculus. The ventral acoustic stria arises from the ventral cochlear nuclei and sends crossed and uncrossed fibers to the ipsilateral and contralateral trapezoid bodies and superior olivatory nuclei before they project to the ipsilateral and contralateral lateral lemnisci. All acoustic striae terminate on the nucleus of the inferior colliculus, which sends its axons to the medial geniculate body through its brachium. From the medial geniculate body, projections are finally made to the primary auditory cortex, which is found on the dorsal surface of the superior temporal gyrus. By the way, the primary auditory cortex is otherwise known as the Heschl's gyrus or the anterior transverse temporal gyrus. The sound is heard once the auditory information reaches the primary auditory cortex. The interpretation of the sound heard occurs in the posterior aspect of the superior temporal gyrus, which corresponds to Wernicke's area. Remember that crossing of the acoustic striae to the contralateral lateral lemniscus occurs at the dorsal pontine tegmentum and not in the medulla. If spinal lemniscus is to the spinothalamic tract, medial lemniscus to the dorsal column pathway, lateral lemniscus is the principal auditory pathway in the brainstem. Decussation or crossing of fibers is important in reflex circuits by which motor phenomena occur in response to cochlear stimulation. It means that auditory reflexes or our involuntary responses to sound stimuli would be impossible if not for the presence of commissural fibers between superior olivatory nuclei, nuclei of the trapezoid body, nuclei of the lateral lemniscus, and inferior colliculi. If the temporal lobe is separated from the parietal lobe, the two transverse gyri on the dorsal surface of the superior temporal gyrus are exposed. The anterior gyrus is the Heschel's gyrus, or the anterior transverse temporal gyrus, corresponding to Brodmann area 41, which is the primary auditory cortex or primary auditory area. So once the auditory information reaches the primary auditory cortex, the sound is heard already. The gyrus posterior to it is the secondary auditory area or Brodmann area 42. This is the superior temporal gyrus. The posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus corresponds to the auditory association area where sound interpretation occurs. This is otherwise known as the Wernicke's area or Brodmann area 22. This table shows the tonotopic organization in the auditory pathway. It means that tones of highest pitch and frequency will stimulate the hair cells located in the most basal portion of the cochlea, followed by the sequential projection of the fibers to the dorsal cochlear nucleus, medial portion of the medial geniculate body, and posteromedial portion of the Heschel's gyrus. The reverse is true for tones of lowest pitch and frequency. The auditory pathway may be classified into monoaural and binaural pathways. The monoaural pathway consists of the projections of the dorsal and intermediate acoustic striae to the contralateral lateral lemniscus. It carries information about the frequency of the auditory signals. Binaural pathway corresponds to the projection of the ventral acoustic striae to the ipsilateral and contralateral lateral lemnisci. It analyzes the location of origin or direction of the auditory signals. What is the olivocochlear or efferent cochlear bundle? It is a descending pathway from the cerebrum down to the hair cells of the organ of Corti. It represents an inhibitory feedback system concerned with regulation or inhibition of certain impulses originating from the cochlea. This would result to the phenomena of auditory sharpening and selective auditory attention. Auditory sharpening refers to the enhancement of those impulses not subject to inhibition, while selective auditory attention is the process by which our brain filters the non-essential sounds and focuses on the sounds to which we are paying attention. Take note that these functions are possible due to the ability of the outer hair cells to regulate the opposition of the tectorial membrane to the inner hair cells. When we talk of auditory reflexes or acoustic reflex mechanisms, the stimulus need not reach the cerebral cortex for them to happen or to occur. For example, audiomotor reflexes are protective reflexes that involve middle ear muscles, namely stapedius and tensor tympani muscles. The stapedius is supplied by the 7th cranial nerve, while the tensor tympani is supplied by the 5th cranial nerve. The impulse is propagated all the way up to the area of the superior olive. From the superior olive, the fibers project bilaterally either to the facial or trigeminal motor neurons that innervate the stapedius or tensor tympani muscle. Another pathway is for the impulse to travel from the superior olive to the reticular formation, and from the reticular formation to the facial and trigeminal motor nuclei via the reticulobulbar tract. For the rest of the auditory reflexes, the impulse travels all the way up to the area of the tectum. From the tectum, the axons project bilaterally to the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves or anterior horn cells that innervate the specific muscle or muscles that would bring about the specific reflex via the tectobulbar or tectospinal tract. There are two types of hearing loss. Conductive and sensory hearing losses. Conductive hearing loss results from anything in the external and middle ear that interferes with the movement of the oval or round window, such as impacted cerumen or otitis media, or when the ossicles fail to transmit the vibrations from the tympanic membrane to the oval window, such as in otosclerosis. Sensory hearing loss results from defects in the receptor, cochlear nerve, brainstem, or cortical connections. This could result from trauma, nerve damage, infection, aging, or occlusion of the internal auditory artery. Tuning fork tests are simple examinations that can be done to detect or test for hearing loss. It can be done either using Weber or Rinne test. Weber test is done by placing the base of vibrating 512 Hz tuning fork on the vertex of the skull or on the midline of the forehead. In a normal test, the sound is equally heard on both sides. With unilateral conductive hearing loss, the sound is louder in the deceased ear, while with unilateral sensorineural hearing loss, the sound is louder in the normal ear. Rinne test, on the other hand, compares the perception of sounds transmitted by air conduction to those transmitted by bone conduction through the mastoid. It is done by placing the base of the vibrating tuning fork on the mastoid process until the patient no longer hears it, and then it is held in air next to the ear being tested. In a normal test, vibrations in the air are heard after bone conduction is over. With unilateral conductive hearing loss, vibrations in air are not heard after bone conduction is over, while with unilateral sensorineural hearing loss, vibrations in the air are heard after bone conduction is over in the normal ear. Unilateral lesions that completely destroy the receptors, cochlear nerve or nuclei, or sound conducting apparatus of the middle ear result to total deafness of the affected ear, while central unilateral lesions involving the cortex, medial geniculate body, or lateral lemniscus result in impaired hearing in both ears, but more marked on the opposite side. This can be explained by the fact that majority of the fibers that make up the auditory pathway cross to the other side. Take note that central hearing loss or central deafness may occur with lesions anywhere along the ascending auditory pathway, starting from the cochlear nuclei, which is located on the dorsolateral surface of the brainstem at the junction of the medulla with the pons, all the way to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. Let's move on to the second part of the lecture, which is about the vestibular system. At the end of the lecture, you should be able to understand the neural pathways for the maintenance of balance or equilibrium by tracing the vestibular tracts to the brainstem, spinal cord, cerebellum, and cerebral cortex, and by correlating how the vestibular functions are supplemented by proprioceptive inputs from the muscles, joints, and the eyes. The function of the vestibular system is for maintenance of body balance, with the eyes, the head, and the body making the necessary adjustments. It also permits the eyes to remain focused on the target even if the head moves. Maintenance of balance is governed by mechanisms that are largely reflexive in character. These mechanisms are not just brought by the vestibular system, but by interplay of several afferent inputs from the dorsal column, spinocerebellar, and visual pathways. For these functions to be carried out, the vestibular pathway has to be intact, meaning the interconnection of the receptors with the cerebellum, spinal cord, ocular motor nuclei, reticular formation, and cerebral cortex via the vestibular nerve should not be interrupted by For example, infection, ischemia, hemorrhage, or tumors. The vestibular receptors are the maculae and the cristae ampullaris. The macula utriculi is found on the floor of the utricle, while the macula saculi is found vertically placed on the middle wall of the saccule. The cristae ampullaris are found in the ampullae of the semicircular ducts. The stimulus is the position or changes in the position of the head. How are these receptors stimulated? When the head is moved, either by contraction of the neck muscles or by shifting the whole body, the cristae are stimulated, and the eyes and the limb muscles adjust accordingly. If the position is sustained or unchanged for a while, the stimulation is transferred to the maculae. The pull of gravity pulls on the otoliths, leading to the bending of the vestibular hair cells. The vestibular receptors may be classified into dynamic and static receptors. Dynamic receptors detect angular and linear motion of the head. Rotational movement of the head is a function of the cristae ampullaris, while linear motion of the head is the function of the maculae. Linear motion refers to the straight line movements of the head. Up and down movements of the head is the function of the macula saculi, while the back and forth movements of the head is the function of the macula utriculi. For example, if you're riding in an elevator with your eyes closed, you can actually sense whether the elevator is going up or going down. If you're sitting at the back seat of the car and very sleepy, you can actually tell whether the car is moving forward or going backward. Static receptors detect position or tilt of the head, and it is the function of the maculae. So, the maculae are both static and dynamic receptors. The maculae are thickenings in the walls of the utricle and the saccule consisting of columnar neuroepithelial cells and supporting cells, covered by gelatinous mass of proteoglycans called otolithic membrane, embedded in which are calcium carbonate crystals called otoliths or otoconia. The apical surface of the hair cell or receptor cell contains around 30 to 50 stereocilia of decreasing length and one kinocilium. Gravity acts on the otoliths or otoconia, drawing the stereocilia away or towards the kinocilium. The structure of the cristae ampullaris is similar to that of the maculae. The hair cells project into the dome-shaped gelatinous mass called the cupula. The cupula fills the ampulla, so it extends wall to wall within the ampulla of the semicircular duct. Movement of the endolymph displaces the cupula, leading to the stimulation of the hair cells. The vestibular nerve accompanies the cochlear nerve in the internal auditory canal as it enters the brainstem at the pontomedullary junction. The vestibular ganglion lies within the internal auditory canal, and the peripheral processes of the vestibular ganglion cells terminate on the vestibular receptors, while the central processes converge to form the vestibular nerve. As soon as the vestibular nerve enters the brainstem, the fibers divide into ascending and descending portions. The fibers of the descending portion terminate on the superior, medial, and descending vestibular nuclei, while the fibers of the ascending portion terminate on the superior and medial vestibular nuclei or directly into the flocculo-nodular lobe as primary vestibulocerebellar fibers. Take note that the vestibular nuclei lie in cluster in the lateral part of the floor of the fourth ventricle, and that inputs from the maculae project predominantly to the lateral and descending vestibular nuclei, while inputs from the cristae project primarily to the superior, medial, and descending vestibular nuclei. The connections of the vestibular nerve centrally give rise to the following pathways, namely vestibulocerebellar, vestibulospinal, vestibuloocular, vestibuloreticular, and vestibulothalamo-cortical pathways. We will be discussing them one by one as we go on with the lecture. The first is the connection of the vestibular nerve to the cerebellum, forming the vestibulocerebellar pathway. The vestibulocerebellar pathway is made up of two types of fibers, the primary vestibulocerebellar fibers and the secondary vestibulocerebellar fibers. The primary vestibulocerebellar fibers project ipsilaterally without interruption to the flocculonodular lobe and uvula via the juxtarestiform body. They do not synapse to the vestibular nuclei. Secondary vestibular fibers do not bypass the vestibular nuclei and are distributed bilaterally within the cerebellum to the flocculonodular lobe, uvula, and fastigial nucleus. I would like to show you that the impulse coming from the vestibular nuclei is projected to the flocculonodular lobe of the cerebellum, and from the flocculonodular lobe of the cerebellum, this same impulse is projected back to the vestibular nuclei as well as to the reticular formation via the fastigiobulbar tract, forming the vestibulo-archicerebellar loop. Take note that the projections of the vestibulocerebellar fibers as well as the fastigiobulbar fibers are bilateral, such that any problem arising from the vestibulocerebellar pathway will be manifested ipsilateral to the lesion. The fastigiobulbar tract, or the tract of Russell, is made up of both crossed and uncrossed fibers that terminate on the vestibular nuclei and reticular formation of the pons and the medulla. The crossed fibers form the uncinate fasciculus. The uncinate fasciculus consists of fastigiobulbar fibers that hook above the superior cerebellar peduncle as they cross to project to the contralateral vestibular nuclei and reticular formation. Both crossed and uncrossed fibers emerge from the juxtarestiform body. Take note that the inferior cerebellar peduncle is made up of a larger entirely afferent portion called the restiform body and a smaller medial portion, juxtarestiform body, that contains the primary and secondary vestibulocerebellar fibers as well as the cerebellovestibular fibers. The second is the connection of the vestibular nerve to the spinal cord called the vestibulospinal pathway. The vestibulospinal pathway is made up of lateral and medial vestibulospinal tracts. The lateral vestibulospinal tract is an uncrossed tract, and its fibers arise from the lateral vestibular nucleus and extend ipsilaterally from the cervical to the lumbosacral segments of the spinal cord. The medial vestibulospinal tract is both crossed and uncrossed tract. Its fibers come mainly from the medial vestibular nucleus, join the descending portion of the medial longitudinal fasciculus, and project ipsilaterally and contralaterally only up to the cervical segments of the spinal cord. It is understandable that both tracts are excitatory to the extensor motor neurons of the spinal cord because their function is to support body weight against gravity and to maintain upright posture. Muscle tone is maintained by a balance of inhibitory and facilitatory influences from the higher centers, such as the cerebral cortex. If the influence of the cerebral cortex is removed in patients with severe brainstem damage as a result of stroke, tumor, infection, or trauma, A clinical condition called decerebrate rigidity occurs, wherein the patient presents with extension of all the limbs, with the arms adducted and internally rotated at the shoulder, and the head and the neck are arched backward. This means that the activity of the vestibulospinal tracts as well as the pontine reticulospinal tract are allowed to occur without control from the cerebral cortex. The third connection is the connection of the vestibular nerve to the extraocular motor nuclei in the brainstem, forming the vestibulo-ocular pathway. In the study of the vestibulo-ocular pathway, it is important to understand that corresponding ducts on opposite sides of the head that lie in the same plane function in pairs. That is, the horizontal duct of one side will be working with the horizontal duct of the opposite side. Same is true for the anterior duct of one side, which will function hand in hand with the posterior duct of the opposite side. If the duct or the canal of one side is stimulated, the duct or the canal of the opposite side is inhibited. It means that if the right horizontal duct is stimulated, the left horizontal duct is inhibited. Likewise, if the right anterior duct is stimulated, the left posterior duct is inhibited, and vice versa. The primary function of the vestibulo-ocular pathway is to prevent slipping of the image from the fovea centralis during head movements. That is, to keep our eyes focused on a specific target even if our head moves. With the eyes focused on a specific target and the head moving to the right horizontal canal is being stimulated, and this would result to the eyes moving towards the left. That means that the muscles in use are the left lateral rectus and the right medial rectus. With the eyes focused on a specific target and the head is rotated forward and to the right anterior canal is being stimulated. Where are the eyes directed? The eyes move upward and to the left. That means that the left superior rectus and the right inferior oblique muscles are contracting simultaneously. With the eyes kept on the object of focus and the head is rotated backward and to the right posterior canal is being stimulated. Again, where are the eyes directed? The eyes move downward and to the left, meaning that the left inferior rectus and the right superior oblique are working together. For the image on the right, notice that most of the fibers that bring about horizontal and vertical eye movements come from the medial and superior vestibular nuclei respectively, and that conjugate eye movements are brought under vestibular control through the medial longitudinal fasciculus. What and where is the medial longitudinal fasciculus located? It is a bundle of tracts in the midline extending from the brainstem all the way down to the ventral funiculus of the cervical segments of the spinal cord. It is heavily myelinated and lies near the midline ventral to the central gray matter. It modulates reflex movements of the head and neck in response to visual and vestibular stimuli. It consists of two portions. The ascending portion includes fibers interconnecting the vestibuli and the extraocular motor nuclei, and the descending portion is made up of several tracts, namely the medial or pontine reticulospinal, medial vestibulospinal, interstitiospinal, tectospinal, and tectobulbar tracts. The vestibulo-ocular reflex can be elicited by doing the oculocephalic or doll's eye or doll's head test. It can be done in conscious or unconscious patients. If it is to be done in a comatose patient, the examiner holds the eyelids with the thumb and index finger of one hand so that he can watch the eyes. Briskly but gently, he rotates the head from side to side and assesses the eye movements. In conscious patient, the patient is asked to fix his gaze on a specific target while the examiner moves the patient's head horizontally and vertically. In patients with positive or normal vestibulo-ocular response, the eyes move in a direction opposite that of the head movement. That is indicative that the brainstem mechanisms for regulating eye movements are intact. The vestibulo-ocular reflex can also be observed by doing the caloric test, in which the otic canal is irrigated either with ice cold or warm water. In cold caloric testing, the eyes deviate to the side of ice water application, while in warm caloric testing, the eyes deviate opposite to the side of warm water application. The fourth is the projection of the vestibular nerve to the reticular formation through its connection to the reticular activating system and various reticular motor nuclei that act as autonomic centers regulating visceral motor functions such as vomiting, coughing, cardiovascular functions, respiration, and speech function. This is exemplified in the use of the rocking chair to put the baby to sleep or when a person traveling by sea experiences dizziness, nausea, and/or vomiting. What is and where is the reticular formation located? The reticular formation is a collection of nuclei forming the central core of gray matter in the brainstem with projections to the spinal cord, hypothalamus, cerebrum, and cerebellum. It consists of three columns, namely the raphe nuclei, gigantocellular nuclei or medial nuclear group, and parvocellular nuclei or lateral nuclear group. The raphe nuclei synthesize the neurotransmitter serotonin, which plays an important role in mood regulation. The gigantocellular nuclei belong to the medial nuclear group, and they give rise to ascending and/or descending tracts. They are large neurons with extensive neuronal projections to the spinal cord, cerebellum, hypothalamus, and cerebral cortex. They are important in processing of pain, visceral function, posture and muscle tone, eye movements, and behavioral arousal. They also participate in the control cycle of sleep and wakefulness. The parvocellular nuclei belong to the lateral nuclear group. They are receptive and integrative in function. They are made up of interneurons with short axons. They are actually the rostral extension of the interneuronal pool in the spinal cord. The last but not the least is the vestibulo-thalamocortical pathway. It refers to the projections from the vestibular nuclei to the cerebrum via the ventro-posterolateral thalamic nuclei. It provides conscious awareness of the position and movements of the head in space. The somatosensory areas of the cerebrum to which the vestibular fibers project include Brodmann Area 7, which corresponds to the posterior areas of the parietal lobe, at the junction of the temporal, insular, and parietal cortices, as well as to Brodmann areas 2 and 3, which are found in the post-central gyrus, subserving joint and muscle spindles respectively. Vestibular lesions result in impaired postural adjustments. There will be unsteadiness, staggering, postural deviation, deviation of the eyes, and nystagmus. If unilateral, the eyes, the head, and the body will turn to the affected side. Why? Going back to the vestibulo-archicerebellar loop, impulses from the vestibular nuclei are projected bilaterally to the cerebellum. and on their way back to the vestibular nuclei, recrossing of fibers occurs, such that manifestations of vestibular lesions will almost always be ipsilateral to the lesion. There will be vertigo and a tendency to fall to the side of lesion. Vertigo should be differentiated from dizziness, lightheadedness, or wooziness. Vertigo refers to the illusion or sensation of whirling either of the individual or his environment, and it usually indicates imbalance within the vestibular system. Not all patients with vertigo have vestibular disorders, and not all patients without vertigo do not have vestibular disorders. That's why these patients should be referred to specialists such as neurologists or neuro-ophthalmologists. Spontaneous nystagmus is present. Nystagmus is a rhythmic, involuntary oscillation of the eyes characterized by slow movement of the eyes in one direction followed by rapid return to the opposite side. It is named for the direction of the rapid phase. Horizontal nystagmus with fast component opposite the deceased ear is often seen in patients with unilateral lesion of the vestibular nerve and/or the receptors, while vertical nystagmus is almost always associated with central lesions involving the vestibular pathway. There are several tests that can be done at bedside to assess vestibular function. These tests would help the clinician in determining whether the patient could be managed on an outpatient basis or should be hospitalized. I will not go through them one by one, but I provided video clips of how these tests are performed. My references include Essentials of Clinical Neuroanatomy and Neurophysiology by Gilman and Newman, Human Neuroanatomy by Carpenter, and Modules in Neuroanatomy by Caragilan-Sang.